Right in the middle of her 80th birthday party, Zainab below leaned in and violently shoved Mama Ifnanya's head straight into the massive cake, in front of everyone. Cream exploded. Candles went out instantly. The entire room fell silent for exactly 1 second, then erupted in laughter. The laughter cut like knives. No one helped her up. No one said a word. Only the music kept playing cheerfully. Cruelly, Mama Ifnanya, a woman who had lived 80 long years, now stood there trembling, her face covered in white cream, her eyes tightly shut as if opening them would force her to face a truth even more painful than what had just happened. The truth that sometimes the deepest pain doesn't come from strangers, but from the very people you once called family. In a corner of the room, Ibrahim Danjuma stood still. His eyes were no longer those of a guest at a party. They were the eyes of a man who had just witnessed something unforgivable. And from that very moment, a secret began to rise, a truth powerful enough to bring this entire mansion crashing down. If you're rewatching this video, take a second to subscribe to the channel, because this story is not just about a party. It's about human nature, silence, and the price of cruelty. Leave a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? And don't look away, because what happens next will make you realize karma may be slow, but it never misses anyone. Zainab Bello slowly pulled her hand back, as if what she had just done were nothing more than a harmless joke at a lavish party. She casually brushed the cream off her fingers, glanced down at her expensive dress, and smirked. It wasn't a loud smile, not exaggerated, but it was cold enough to make the air in the room seem to tighten. 80 years old, she said lightly, her voice thin and sharp like a blade. You should know your place by now. A few laughs broke out immediately. Not everyone truly found it funny. Some laughed to flatter. Some laughed out of fear, afraid of becoming the outsider in a room like this. Others laughed simply because they had grown used to cruelty being disguised as entertainment. The crystal glasses still shimmered under the chandelier. The music continued to flow. The scent of expensive perfume, sweet frosting, and grilled meat blended together into something luxurious yet suffocating. At the center of all that humiliation, Mama Ifnanya stood still, her back slightly hunched, her thin shoulders trembling ever so faintly. White cream covered her silver hair, clung to her forehead, her eyelids, her deeply lined cheeks. A drop of frosting slid slowly down to her collar, as if time itself were trying to memorize every second of this disgrace. Her aged hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles pushed sharply against her wrinkled skin. People expected her to cry, or to tremble with anger, or to scream in pain and humiliation, like anyone publicly shamed in front of dozens of staring eyes. But she didn't. Mama Ifnanya slowly raised her head. The movement was heartbreakingly slow, as if what weighed on her neck was not just the heavy cream, but 80 years of endurance. A lifetime of swallowing poverty, loss, betrayal, and loneliness. The cream on her lashes forced her to blink several times. And when her eyes finally opened, what appeared in them was not anger. It was familiarity. A terrifying familiarity, the kind that comes from someone who has endured so much that pain no longer triggers a violent reaction. It simply sinks like a stone dropped into an old well. No sound, no ripple, but so deep no one can see the bottom. Tund Bello stood just a few steps away from his mother, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, a luxury watch peeking from his cuff. His face carried a calmness that didn't feel right. Or maybe it wasn't calmness, it was cowardice. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but then closed again. His hand tightened around his glass. His knuckles turned pale. He looked at his mother, then at his wife, then at the guests surrounding them, waiting to see how he would respond. And in the end, he did nothing. He didn't step forward. He didn't wipe the cream from his mother's face. He didn't get angry. He didn't tell Zainab she had crossed the line. Tund's silence hurt more than the hand that had shoved her into the cake, because humiliation from cruelty is at least understandable. but silence from the very child you gave birth to, raised, and sacrificed your entire life for. That is the deepest knife of all. Mama Ifananya looked at her son. Just looked. No accusation. No plea. No begging. And that alone made a few people in the room uncomfortable enough to turn away. Because in her eyes, there was no weakness, no desperation, only a sadness so old it no longer had a name, as if she had known, for a long time, that one day she would stand in this exact moment under dazzling lights, among people called family, surrounded by the merciless laughter of those who feed on someone else's pain. In the corner of the room, Ibrahim Danjuma set his glass down. The soft clink of glass against wood was quiet, but in that moment, it rang clear. He said nothing. He took one step forward, then stopped. His gaze didn't go to the ruined cake, nor did it linger on Zainab's victorious expression. It stayed on Mama Ifunania for a long time, long enough that it felt as though he was just seeing the frail, elderly woman standing there, but seeing through the cream, through the worn traditional outfit, through the fragile frame, into a long chain of unseen days. The meals she must have eaten in silence. The harsh words she must have heard behind closed doors. The times she was likely pushed away from the table, from conversations, from the very home she once believed would shelter her in her final years. There was something in Ibrahim's gaze that began to change the room. Zainab's smile didn't disappear, but the corner of her lips stiffened. She realized she was being watched not with surprise, but with recognition, as if this man had just witnessed the final piece, needed to complete a picture he had long suspected. Tun felt it too. He turned toward Ibrahim, trying to maintain composure, but the collar of his shirt had begun to dampen with sweat. A flicker of unease crossed his face so quickly others might have missed it. But Mama Ifunanya saw it, and Ibrahim saw it. The party was still there, but it no longer felt like a birthday celebration. It felt like a room where the truth had just begun to enter. Not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly and with certainty. Mama Ifananya raised her hand and wiped the cream from the corner of her eye. Her hand trembled, but her gaze did not. For the first time since her head had been shoved into the cake, she turned to look directly at Zainab. For a long moment, there was still no anger in her eyes, and that made it even more unsettling, because people can defend themselves against tears, against shouting, against rage. But it is far harder to stand against the silence of someone who has been hurt too many times. And in that moment, while the music still played and the extinguished candles leaned crookedly on the ruined cake, a strange feeling began to spread among the guests. That this was not just humiliation, that behind Mama Ifunania's silence was an entire history left untold, and that Ibrahim Danjuma had not stepped forward out of pity. He stepped forward like a man who had finally seen what he needed to see. In that brightly lit mansion, no one said it out loud, but everyone began to feel it. Tonight, the most terrifying thing was not Zainab's cruelty. It was the silence of those who knew too much and might not stay silent any longer. Turn off the music. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It moved through the room like a cold blade, gliding across water, pretending to be still, and in an instant it split the artificial atmosphere of the party into two unmistakable halves. On one side, display, cruelty, and triumph. On the other, a silence beginning to take the shape of judgment. The birthday song was cut off mid-play. The cheerful sound vanished so abruptly that breathing, the soft clink of crystal glasses, even the hum of the air conditioner overhead suddenly became strangely clear. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. Every eye in the room turned toward the man who had spoken, Ibrahim Danjuma. He stepped out of the darker corner of the room, slowly but without the slightest hesitation. Each step was so steady that even the polished marble floor beneath him seemed to grow heavier. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture wildly. He needed no dramatic display. Shh. And yet there was an invisible pressure around him that made the same People who had been laughing at an 80-year-old woman just moments before suddenly feel their throats go dry. He stopped in front of the large screen mounted on the wall, where only minutes earlier a carefully curated slideshow of Mama Ifunania's birthday photos had been playing images that looked warm, joyful, perfect, the way people often try to make a family look on the outside when everything inside is already rotting. "Bring up the house cameras," Ibrahim said. His voice was low, concise, not a word wasted. Zainab laughed immediately. A sharp, short laugh, like fingernails scraping across glass. "And who exactly are you to give orders here?" She folded her arms across her chest and lifted her chin, trying to hold on to the posture of someone who still believed she controlled everything. Her elegant fitted dress, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light, her flawless lipstick, her carefully styled hair, everything about Zainab still projected the polished image of wealth and power. But not her eyes. For just a moment, something flashed there, small, quick, but unmistakable. Caution. Ibrahim did not answer her. He did not even look at her. He kept his eyes on the dark screen on the wall, as if to him, the question of who he was mattered far less than what the truth was about to reveal. That silence alone made several guests swallow hard, because some people react the moment they are challenged, eager to defend themselves. But there are others who do not need to answer at all, because they themselves are already the answer. Tund Bello took half a step forward, then stopped. "Ibrahim, there's no need to make this bigger than it is. No need." Ibrahim cut in, turning to look at him for the first time. Just one look. Tund went silent. That look was not explosive anger. It was calm in a way that felt terrifying. The look of a man who had observed long enough, pieced together enough fragments, and no longer cared about protecting anyone's dignity tonight. There was disappointment in it, contempt, and more than anything a certainty so sharp that the person on the receiving end understood immediately. No one here would be allowed to hide behind cheap excuses anymore. The estate's technical manager stood near the drinks counter, so flustered that his hands were nearly stuck together. He looked at Tund, then at Zainab, then back at Ibrahim. Sweat glistened on his temples despite the cold room. The entire space waited in utter silence. Finally, under the suffocating weight of that silence, he quietly walked toward the control panel. The large screen lit up. At first there were only light static streaks, a few signal boxes, then the image sharpened. The living room appeared. The birthday cake appeared. Mama Ifunania appeared, standing with her eyes closed, making a wish, her aged hands gently folded near each other. And then, no one could say they had misunderstood. No one could claim they had seen it wrong. No one could pretend anymore that what had just happened was nothing but an overdone joke. On the screen, Zainab approached from behind. Her smile was clear. Her hand was clear. The brutal shove of an 80-year-old woman's head into the frosting was also clear, mercilessly clear. No editing, no distortion, no blind angle. The entire room was forced to watch again the very moment they had just witnessed. Only this time they were no longer allowed to hide behind collective laughter. Through the cold eye of the camera, it was no longer a joke at a party. It was humiliation, naked, precise, impossible to excuse. The ladder from earlier had vanished completely. An older woman among the guests lifted a hand to cover her mouth. A man beside her lowered his glass without realizing his hand was shaking. Some turned to look at Zainab as though, for the first time, they were truly seeing who she was. Some lowered their eyes. Some simply stood frozen, as if ashamed that only minutes earlier they themselves had laughed along with the crowd. But that was only the beginning. Ibrahim tilted his head slightly. Rewind. The technician swallowed hard and obeyed. The footage rolled backward. Faster. Guests moved in reverse like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. The candlelight reignited. The cake became whole again. The party had not yet begun. Then farther back, 1 day earlier, the screen shifted to the back kitchen. Mama Ifunania stood alone by the sink, slowly drying a few plates. Her body bent slightly beneath the cold white light overhead. Behind her, Zainab appeared. No guests, no music, no performative laughter. On camera, her face looked completely different from the polished social face she wore in public, colder, rougher, stripped of all disguise. She said something. The audio was unclear, but from her mouth and expression alone, everyone could tell the words were harsh. Then her hand slapped the dish towel from the old woman's hand onto the floor. Mama Ifunania bent to pick it up. Too slowly, Zainab shoved her shoulder. She lost her balance. She fell beside the kitchen cabinet. A collective intake of breath swept through the present-day living room. Mother Tund let out the word dryly, almost involuntarily, but no one responded to him, because on the screen, no one helped the old woman up. She had to grip the edge of the counter and struggle back to her feet with trembling hands. By then, Zainab had already turned and walked away, as if what had fallen to the floor was not a human being, but an inconvenient object in her path. "Keep going," Ibrahim said. 1 week earlier. This time the footage showed the smaller dining room in the back, not the grand dining room used for guests. There, beneath weak yellow lighting, Mama Ifunania sat alone at a table pushed into the corner. In front of her was a plate of cold food. Meanwhile, from the hallway camera, the main dining room could be seen brightly lit, the long table overflowing with dishes, people talking and laughing. Only she had been separated out like an unwanted shadow inside the very house that carried her son's name. She ate very slowly, not because she wanted to savor it, but because loneliness can make every bite feel heavy as stone. At one point she paused and turned her head toward the sound of laughter drifting in from the next room. That look made the entire room in the present tighten with emotion. It was not jealousy. It was not resentment. It was only the quiet sadness of someone reminding herself. Do not bother them. Do not go in there. Do not give them one more reason to be annoyed by your presence. A housemaid passed by carrying water. She was just about to set the glass down for her when Zainab appeared at the end of the hallway. Just one cold point of the finger. The maid stopped immediately, turned, and carried the water elsewhere. Mama Ifunania saw everything, but she only lowered her eyes and continued eating her dry meal in silence. No one in the living room could keep an indifferent face anymore. The truth on the screen was not loud. It was not dramatic in the cinematic sense, and that made it hurt even more. Because what made it unbearable was how obvious it was that this had happened many times before, repeated, normalized, absorbed into the daily routine of the house to the point that no one there had even felt the need to hide from the cameras, as if cruelty itself had become a household habit. Keep going. Now, the footage showed the hallway leading to the backyard. Zainab stood in front of two housemaids. Mama Ifunania stood slightly behind, her hands clasped together, making herself smaller as if she wanted to disappear into the wall. Zainab pointed straight at her face. Her mouth moved in sharp, cutting sentences. From her expression and gestures alone, no one could mistake it for advice or an argument. This was humiliation. Systematic, habitual, intentional. One maid lowered her head, too afraid to look. The other stood rigid like a statue, and Mama Ifunania, she did not argue. She did not react. She did not cry. She simply stood there, quietly listening, like someone who already knew that no matter what she said, no one would stand beside her. Somewhere in the living room, someone whispered, "Oh my God." The whisper was so faint it nearly dissolved into the air, but it felt like the final gunshot, shattering the artificial shell of the evening, because now no one could lie to themselves anymore and say they had only witnessed a moment of impulse. No, this was a long pattern of abuse, a life worn down in silence, an elderly mother forced to disappear from her own dignity inside the very home where she should have been honored the most. Zainab was still standing there, but her smile was gone completely. Her lips were pressed tight. Her cheekbones had stiffened. For the first time that night, Cracks were beginning to show in the confidence she wore so carefully. She stared at the screen as if she wanted to rush forward, shut it off, smash it, erase everything. But cameras do not pity. Cameras do not fear status. Cameras do not favor the beautiful, the wealthy, or the skilled performer. They simply record. And tonight, they were returning the full truth to its rightful owner. Tun took a step back. His face had gone pale. What appeared on the screen did not only expose Zainab. It exposed him as well, his cowardice, his willful blindness, his complicit silence, as a son who had allowed his mother to grow old in humiliation beneath his own roof. Ibrahim remained standing before the screen. His shadow stretched long across the floor, straight and heavy like a verdict not yet spoken aloud, but already felt by everyone. No one laughed anymore. No one defended her anymore. No one had enough courage left to pretend this was merely a private family matter. Because now, under the cold, merciless light of the camera, everything stood revealed. Not a joke, not a moment of anger, but cruelty repeated day after day, again and again, against an elderly mother nearing the end of her life. And in that moment, while the entire room stood frozen in stunned silence, everyone understood. Tonight, the truth had only just begun to unmask the people standing inside this mansion. That was just a misunderstanding. Zainab's voice cracked across the room, no longer carrying the cold, controlled sharpness it had held just minutes earlier. It had thinned out, dried up, turned unsteady like a sheet of glass, suddenly showing its first fractures. She stepped forward half a step, both hands clenched tightly in front of her stomach, her eyes darting quickly from Ibrahim's stone-cold face to the screen, still glowing on the wall, as if by speaking fast enough, cleverly enough, and repeating the right familiar phrases, she could still drag everything back into the fog of doubt. It was just a misunderstanding, she repeated, forcing a smile, though the corners of her mouth had gone stiff. Everyone saw it was a birthday party. The atmosphere just got a little. That's enough. Ibrahim cut her off. The two words were not harsh, not loud. But the moment they fell, the entire room seemed to sink another level deeper into silence. No one could even hear the air conditioner anymore. No one dared shift their feet. Even the guests, who had still been hoping this was nothing more than an awkward scene that could be smoothed over with a few polite words, now understood that the door back had closed. Ibrahim no longer looked at Zainab. He turned and walked toward Mama Ifunanya. The elderly woman still stood there, her back slightly bent, her silver hair matted with frosting, her hands folded together, as though, even in the middle of being humiliated, she was still afraid of becoming a burden to anyone. Under the warm lights of the luxurious mansion, her figure looked heartbreakingly small. So small it felt as if one more strong gust of wind might reduce her to dust made from years of endurance. Ibrahim stopped in front of her. Then, before dozens of unblinking eyes, he pulled a white handkerchief from the pocket of his suit jacket. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hand and gently wiped the frosting still clinging to Mama Ifunanya's forehead, her cheekbones, the corner of her mouth, as if it were not merely birthday cake, but a wound he could not bear to leave on her face for even 1 second longer. The whole room held its breath. The gesture was not loud, but that was exactly why it struck so deeply. Because on a night when everything had exposed cruelty, that quiet act of tenderness suddenly became more powerful than any accusation. It felt like a silent but unmistakable declaration. This woman has worth. She has dignity. She has a history none of you had any right to trample. Mama Ifunanya lifted her eyes to Ibrahim. Her gaze trembled slightly, not out of fear, not even simply out of emotion. It was the look of someone who never expected that after so many years of lowering her head and enduring in silence, one day a hand would touch her with respect. Her lips moved faintly, as if she wanted to say something, but Ibrahim gave the slightest shake of his head, as if to say, "Today, You do not have to apologize to anyone anymore. You do not have to explain yourself. Today, the truth will speak for itself." Then he turned back. His eyes settled on Tund first. The man who had stood frozen, while his mother was humiliated now, looked as though someone had taken the spine out of him. His face had gone pale. His collar seemed too tight around his neck. At some point his wine glass had disappeared from his hand. But what frightened him most was not the video, not the crowd. It was the way Ibrahim was looking at him, not as a business associate, not as an acquaintance, not as someone who could negotiate his way out of this, but as a man who had failed at the most basic duty of a human life. Being a son, Ibrahim began, his voice deepening, each word measured and deliberate. "Once raised me when I had nothing." The moment the sentence ended, the entire room froze. Tund blinked as if he must have heard wrong. "What did you say?" Ibrahim did not break eye contact. "I used to sleep on the street," he said. "There were nights when I didn't know where I would wake up the next morning. I was a boy no one wanted to look at. No family. Not a single door open to me." His voice remained steady, but every word carried the weight of something dragged up from a deep, old place, the place where people bury the most humiliating memories of poverty just to keep living. "One rainy night," he continued, "I was curled up beneath the awning of an old market in Kano. I was so hungry I could barely stand. People passed by and looked at me like I was garbage with legs. Some shooed me away. Some laughed. No one stopped," he paused, "except her. Every eye in the room turned toward Mama Ifunanya. She stood still, but her lips trembled. One hand slowly rose to her chest, as if that aging heart had just been awakened by a memory she herself had believed was buried forever. She didn't ask who I was," Ibrahim said. "She didn't ask where my parents were. She didn't ask whether I deserved help. She simply handed me a bowl of hot soup, a dry place to sit, and said something I have never forgotten." His voice dropped lower. She said, "You do not have to die on the street, just because no one sees you." A quiet shiver moved through the people listening, because there are words that, coming from a billionaire in a boardroom, people would call wisdom. But when they came from a poor woman, spoken to a starving street boy in the rain, they became something else. They became salvation. Ibrahim took another slow step forward, as if he too were walking backward into the years behind him. "She let me stay in her little house. A roof that had almost nothing in it except old walls, a thin mat, and a pot of rice that always had to be divided into smaller and smaller portions to last for days. But to me, it was the first palace I ever knew. She fed me before she fed herself. She forced me to go to school when she herself had to sell her last pair of bracelets just to pay my first tuition." Then he looked straight at Tund. "And when I wanted to give up because people looked down on me, she was the only one who told me that poverty is not a crime." He paused. "Ingratitude is." Tund stepped back. Clearly he wanted to say something, but his throat seemed locked shut. His eyes widened as he looked at his mother, as if for the first time realizing she was not merely an old woman, living quietly under his roof, but a human being who had once helped save the entire life of the most powerful man in the room. Zainab had gone completely pale. There was nothing left now of the woman who had stood with her chin high amid the crowd's laughter just moments earlier. All the flawless makeup, all the glittering jewelry, every polished gesture she had practiced to project status and class. Suddenly, it all looked unnecessary and cheap. Because in that room, power no longer rested in what she wore. It rested in the story now being told. And in that story, she was nothing more than the woman who had humiliated the benefactor of a man she had never truly understood. Ibrahim turned his gaze across the room. His eyes moved over each guest, each face that had stood silently witnessing all of this, then stopped on the large screen where the images of Mama Ifunania's abuse still remained like evidence no one could erase. "You see her today," he said, "in simple clothes, with silver hair, old sandals, and a slow walk. And you thought you had seen the full value of a human being. No one dared breathe too loudly. You were wrong. The 4 words fell as lightly as dust, but their weight seemed to press the whole room lower. I am the man behind Danjuma Group. The sound of several people inhaling at once rippled through the room. One guest dropped a fork onto a plate without realizing it. The sharp clatter of metal against china rang through the silence. Another turned abruptly to the person beside him, as if waiting for confirmation that he had not misheard. There are names that require no introduction, once spoken aloud. Danjuma Group was one of those names. An empire so powerful that merely connected to it was enough for everyone in the room to understand. This was a level of power most of them could only reach through appointments, investments, or timely submission. Ibrahim did not stop. That same company, he said, his voice turning colder, has been standing behind the lines of credit, the contracts, the money flow your family has been living on. Tund was so stunned he could no longer even maintain the last fragments of his outward composure. That's impossible. It is possible, Ibrahim replied. Very possible. He stepped closer, close enough that Tund had no choice but to lift his head and face the truth directly. This mansion, these parties, the relationships you love to parade around, the glittering image that you and your wife wear like clothing. Ibrahim paused, his eyes never leaving him. It is far more fragile than you think. A great many things in this house exist, not because you are powerful. He let the words settle, but because someone allowed them to exist. Tund could not speak anymore. Sweat gathered at his temples. His arms hung limp at his sides. In one night, in only a few short minutes, he had lost the 2 greatest supports of his life, the illusion of power and the privilege of looking away. Zainab stammered, I didn't know. Exactly, Ibrahim said, turning toward her. You didn't know. You didn't know that the woman whose head you just shoved into a birthday cake was the one who once shared her last half bowl of porridge with me when there was nothing left in her house. You didn't know that the aging hands you looked down on once mended my clothes so I could go to school. You didn't know that her silence was not weakness. He paused, his voice lowering until it sounded like steel sliding through silk. It was mercy. No one in the room could look directly at Mama Ifunanya anymore, because from that moment on, she no longer appeared as merely an old woman humiliated at a party. She stood revealed as something deeper, a root, the person who had quietly planted one seed of kindness into the world, then forgotten she had even planted it, only for that seed, many years later, to grow into something so vast, it could cast shade over the very people who had once looked down on her. Mama Ifunanya trembled slightly. A single tear slid silently from the corner of an eye that had already been wiped clean of frosting. But it was no longer the tear of humiliation. It was something deeper, an old wound, suddenly being named, a kindness she had thought life had forgotten, now returning to her, not as comfort, but as a truth powerful enough to shake the whole house. Ibrahim slowly turned back toward her. This time his voice dropped lower, almost soft. Mama Ifunanya. The way he said it made several people flinch. Not her, not this woman, but a name spoken with love, gratitude, and a lifetime of remembrance. I owe you my life, he said, and tonight, no one will ever be allowed to trample on you again. Shh, outside, the night wind tapped softly against the towering glass windows of the mansion. Inside, the lights were still warm, the cake still ruined, the candles still extinguished, and the guests still stood like statues awakened by shame. But everything had changed, completely, because standing before them now was not merely Ibrahim Danjuma. It was Ibrahim Danjuma, a billionaire, a man who had once slept on the street, a man who had once had nothing, and the boy Mama Ifunanya had once rescued from the dark. The room fell into absolute silence. No one had enough strength left to laugh. No one had enough courage left to pretend this was merely a birthday party that had gone awkwardly off rhythm, because the truth that had just come out had not merely cracked the atmosphere. It had ripped apart the entire false identity that certain people in this house had relied on to hold their heads high. And everyone understood. When a man like Ibrahim Danjuma reveals who he truly is immediately after publicly naming Mama Ifunanya as his benefactor, then tonight, the price of cruelty is finally about to be paid. The atmosphere in the mansion shifted so abruptly it felt almost tangible against the skin. Just minutes ago, this place had been a stage for laughter, for smug satisfaction, for the kind of hollow power built on money, expensive clothes, and the cowardly silence of a crowd. But now, all of it had been stripped away. The golden lights still hung above. Wine glasses still shimmered in the hands of guests who hadn't yet set them down. The sweet scent of frosting still lingered in the air. And yet everything had grown heavy, like the room had been dragged deep beneath an ocean, where no one could breathe through pretense anymore. The ones who had laughed the loudest were now the first to lower their eyes. A woman in a red dress stepped back behind a column, avoiding Zainab's gaze, as if even a moment of eye contact might place her name on the invisible indictment forming in the room. A middle-aged man loosened his tie, sweat gathering at his neck despite the steady air conditioning. Some pretended to check their phones. Others tried to start meaningless conversations, but their voices trembled so badly no one answered. No one wanted to be remembered as one of the people who stood there, watched an 80-year-old woman be humiliated, and chose to laugh. And in the middle of that quiet turning away, Zainab stood as if abandoned on a collapsing bridge. Just minutes ago, she had been the center of the party, the woman who could command servants with a glance, who could humiliate her mother-in-law and still keep a smile on her lips, who believed that with her husband's silence and the crowd's weakness, she would never have to face consequences. Now, the very people who had laughed along with her were the first to avoid her. That is how false power dies. Not with thunder, but with the direction of people's eyes. Tunbello stood frozen in the middle of the room, but his entire body trembled in small, uncontrollable waves. His lips had gone dry. His hands opened and closed as if his mind still hadn't caught up with how quickly everything had collapsed. He looked at Ibrahim, at the screen, at Zainab, and finally at his mother. Mom, the word came out hoarse, scraped raw from his throat. This. He could finish. Because even he didn't know what he was trying to say. Was it an apology? And for what? For allowing his wife to humiliate his mother on her own birthday. For ignoring her suffering for months, maybe years, while she was pushed into the shadows of his own home. Or for the fact that only now, when he realized the man defending her was a powerful billionaire, he had finally begun to feel fear. There are apologies that come too late, so late that they become an insult themselves. Mama Ifunanya did not answer. She simply stood there, her back still slightly bent, her face still marked by the humiliation of the night. The handkerchief Ibrahim had used still rested in his hand, bright white, against a room full of pale faces. She looked at her son for a long time without saying a single word. And that silence pressed down on Tund harder than any accusation ever could. If she had cried, he might have run forward, dropped to his knees, clung to her legs, begged for forgiveness. If she had shouted, he might have used it to convince himself that she still cared enough to speak. But she didn't. Mama Ifunanya only looked. There was no anger in her eyes. No expectation either. Just a calmness so painful it felt like standing before a lake after a violent storm still. Not because nothing had happened, but because everything that could break had already broken long ago. And in that gaze, Tund saw the most terrifying truth of his life. His mother no longer expected him to protect her, no longer believed he would stand by her. A mother's love was still there, but her trust was gone. Tund stepped back half a step as if struck in the chest. Zainab stepped back too. She could no longer hold her proud posture. Her hands touched, then fell apart. Her shoulders stiffened. The carefully constructed lines of her made-up face began to warp under the pressure of fear. I didn't know, she stammered, her eyes darting wildly, searching for anyone among the guests to speak in her defense. There was no one, because every path of defense had been sealed by the camera. The camera did not exaggerate. It did not take sides. It did not forget. It did not grow tired. It had seen her push the old woman in the kitchen. It had seen her point and humiliate her in front of the staff. It had seen the cold meals eaten alone in the corner, like an unwanted presence. And now, under the bright lights of the room, it had become a witness that could not be bribed, intimidated, or silenced. Zainab turned to Tund like a drowning person, reaching for the last thread. Say something you know. I didn't mean it, you know that. But Tund didn't look at her. For the first time that night, he no longer hid behind silence. But it was too late. His eyes stayed on his mother, then dropped to the floor like a man who had finally realized he had been standing on the wrong side his entire life. Ibrahim Danjuma stepped forward. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to compress the room under invisible pressure. Under the lights, his face was carved in stone firm, yielding. But there was no impulsive anger there, no uncontrolled rage. There was something far more dangerous. Decision. He looked at Tund first, then at Zainab. Finally, his gaze swept across the entire room, as if making sure everyone present understood that what he was about to say was not only for one couple but for anyone who had ever believed they could trample a vulnerable elder and hide it behind the word family. From today, Ibrahim said slowly, each word landing like a strike against marble, you will have nothing that belongs to her anymore. No one moved. At first, it sounded like a moral judgment, but within seconds, everyone understood it was more than that. Because in this house, in this life, in the social status Tund and Zainab wore so proudly, how much of it truly belonged to them. The mansion, the investments, the business connections, the contracts waiting to be signed, the luxurious foundation they stood on. If most of those existed within the influence of Danjuma Group, and Ibrahim had just made it clear that connection began with a deb to Mama, if Unania, then that sentence was not spoken in anger. It was a severance, a cold cut through velvet power, exposing the bare skeleton beneath. Zainab seemed to understand at the same moment as everyone else. Her face turned ghost white, her legs gave way, and as if all the strength had been drained from her, in a single instant, she collapsed to her knees. Her expensive dress spread around her like a crushed flower. Her hands reached blindly for support, but found nothing. The sound of her knees hitting the floor echoed sharply through the silent room. A few guests flinched, but no one stepped forward. I am sorry, she cried, her voice breaking apart. I am sorry, please give me another chance. She looked at Ibrahim first, then turned to Mama Ifunanya. The final mask had fallen completely. There was no arrogance left, no contempt. Only raw panic, the kind that comes when someone realizes, this is no longer a family argument. This is total collapse. Mother, she choked. I was wrong, I truly did know. The word mother came too late. So late it sounded like something borrowed and cheap. Mama Ifunanya did not respond. She looked down at the daughter-in-law kneeling before her. Just looked. No satisfaction. No revenge. No anger unleashed. And that made the scene even more painful. Because the compassion of those who have been deeply wounded is not weakness. It is like a mountain that has endured storms, standing still, silently forcing those kneeling before it to understand. Forgiveness is not something you can simply ask for and receive. Tund seemed to snap awake. He rushed forward half a step, then stopped again, unsure if he still had the right to stand between his wife and the consequences. Ibrahim, please, his voice trembled uncontrollably. Give us a chance to make this right. I will make it up to my mother. You will. Ibrahim turned, his voice low and cold. What will you do? Turn back time. Erase the nights she ate alone. Erase the fall in the kitchen. Erase the look in a mother's eyes when her own son stood there, and didn't he protect her? Tund froze. Every question struck exactly where it hurt most, because Ibrahim did not accuse with anger. He accused with truth, and truth is always sharper. You didn't just fail as a husband, Ibrahim said. You failed first as a son. Something inside Tund collapsed, even though he was still standing. The room was so silent that Zainab's broken sobs could be heard clearly. Yet strangely, there was no sympathy for her. No one moved to help her. No one spoke in her defense. No one mentioned family anymore. Because tonight, they had all just seen the limit of forgiveness. Forgiveness may exist for a mistake, but not easily for cruelty repeated and nurtured with contempt. One guest turned her face away, unable to watch Zainab kneeling. A man clenched his glass so tightly wine spilled onto his sleeve. Someone sighed quietly. But no one intervened, because everyone understood. If they spoke now, they wouldn't save Zainab. They would only expose themselves. Ibrahim turned back to Mama Ifananya. For the first time that night, something like quiet expectation appeared in his eyes, not waiting for her command, not waiting for anger, but respect, as if he knew that even though he could destroy everything in this room with a few phone calls, the greatest moral authority here was not him. It was her. Mama Ifananya exhaled slowly. Her thin fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of her clothing. Her gaze passed over Zainab, kneeling over Tund, trembling over the guests, avoiding her eyes, and finally rested on the ruined birthday cake. 80 years, an entire life. She had raised a child, endured hardship, remained silent, sacrificed everything. And on the day she should have been honored, she had been shoved into a cake in front of everyone. No, this humiliation could not disappear with a single apology. Outside, the night wind brushed softly against the glass, like the quiet sigh of fate. Inside, the luxurious mansion had become something else entirely. Not a party, a courtroom, no judge, no gavel, no written law, and yet everyone knew. The sentence had already begun to form. Zainab still knelt. Tund still did not dare step forward. Ibrahim still stood like a pillar of truth. And Mama Ifananya, the woman once seen as the weakest in the house, was the only one who did not tremble. And in that moment, everyone understood. Karma does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes with a camera that never lies, with a debt of kindness long buried, with the silence of a mother who has suffered so deeply she no longer needs to speak. And when it finally falls, those who kneel and beg for another chance may find that no one is left to reach out a hand. Ibrahim Danjuma slowly bent down, not hurried, not theatrical, not like a man who had just silenced an entire luxury mansion with only a few words. In that moment, he no longer looked like a billionaire standing at the summit of power, nor the man who had just delivered a cold judgment that shattered a family in the middle of a birthday party. He was simply a man bowing before the woman who had once pulled him out of the darkness of hunger, cold, and namelessness. He held out his hand. Strong, steady. Mama Ifananya looked at that hand for a long time. Her eyes had lived through too many years of humiliation to believe that every hand extended toward her truly meant to lift her up. Some hands help only to control. Some hands caress only to wound more deeply another day. Some hands in her life had promised protection, only to let go at the exact moment she needed them most. But Ibrahim's hand was different. There was no pity in it, only gratitude and respect. At last, Mama Ifananya placed her thin, slightly trembling hand into his. Ibrahim helped her to her feet. That simple movement silenced the room all over again. Because some images need no words to become a verdict. The 80-year-old woman who had just been shoved face first into a cake in front of everyone was now being lifted up by the most powerful man in the room, with both hands, as if she were the person most worthy of honor there. That respect had come late, very late, painfully late. But even so, it shone brightly in a room full of people who had looked at her like nothing more than an aging shadow that could be pushed into any corner. A kind of respect she may have waited for her whole life. Mama Ifunanya stood a little straighter as Ibrahim held her by the arm. She was still small, still fragile, still shaped like a woman worn down by years of labor, sacrifice, and unnamed sorrows. But under the warm glow of the mansion lights, she no longer looked like someone to be pitied. She looked like someone who was finally being given back her dignity. Ibrahim inclined his head toward her, his voice lowered, deep and warm, soft enough that only those closest could hear, and yet it felt like words, meant for the two of them alone. "Mama," he said quietly, "let's go home." The moment those words were spoken, the air in the room seemed to tremble, because through all the insults, the footage, the exposed secrets, and the collapse of false identities, those were the gentlest words of the night. And that was exactly why they carried the greatest weight. It was not merely an invitation to leave the party. It was a declaration that beyond this mansion, beyond the children who bore the name of family, but did not know how to protect their mother, beyond the table, where she had just been humiliated, there was still another place waiting for her, a place where she did not have to lower her head, a place where she did not have to eat alone in a dark corner, a place where her presence was not treated like a burden. Home. Shitund looked as if he had just been stabbed once more straight through the chest. "Mom," he burst out, his voice breaking completely as he instinctively stepped forward. "Mom, please listen to me." But Mama Ifunanya did not turn back right away. That alone was enough to make him understand the full size of what he had lost. All his life, whenever he called, she turned back, no matter how tired she was, no matter how hurt, no matter if he himself had been the one to disappoint her. She still turned, because she was his mother. But today that woman did not turn back right away. That silence hurt more than a slammed door ever could. Zainab was still kneeling on the stone floor, her trembling hands clutching the fabric of her dress. Her mascara had run, her lipstick had lost its clean edge, and the face once so carefully made up to project perfection had become a portrait of panic and collapse. She looked up at Mama Ifunanya, at Ibrahim, then at the hands supporting her as she began to walk away. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time in her life, Zainab understood what it meant to be left behind by the consequences of her own actions. "Please, please, done, go," she sobbed. But her voice was too weak, too late, too broken to hold on to anything anymore. Mama Ifunanya paused for exactly one brief beat. The whole room held its breath. Tun thought she would turn back. Zainab thought she would soften. The guests thought they were about to witness some moment of forgiveness that would restore, at least, a little comfort to their consciences. But Mama Ifunanya only closed her eyes gently. A slow breath moved through her fragile chest, as if she were releasing a part of her life that had hurt too much to keep carrying. Then she kept walking, without saying a word, without blame, without accusation, because some departures are, by themselves, the strongest ending of all. Ibrahim walked with her through that vast room, past the long white-clothed table, where the expensive food still sat untouched, past the guests who automatically stepped aside, as if even the space itself understood it. It had to make room for dignity. Past the large screen still dimly glowing after the footage that had exposed the truth. Their steps were not quick, but certain. They were not fleeing, and they did not look back for anyone. No one dared stop them. No one dared speak, not because they feared Ibrahim Danjuma, but because in that moment, everyone felt that if they said anything, they would only reveal their own shame more clearly. One of the house staff quietly opened the large doors wide. Night air drifted in from outside, cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp grass beneath the late-night dew. It passed through the suffocating room, like a reminder that even the darkness outside was purer than all the false splendor inside this mansion. When they reached the doorway, Mama Ifunanya finally tilted her head slightly. She did not look at Zainab. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Tund, only for a moment. But that look was enough to leave him frozen. There was no curse in it, no blazing anger, only a sadness so deep it had become calm, and so distant that he understood. From this moment on, Even if his mother still lived, even if she remained in this world, something in the bond between them had broken. She might still pray for him. Her heart might still be unable to stop loving the son she gave birth to. But the trust, the refuge, the feeling of this is where I belong that she had once placed in him. All of it had been left behind somewhere, between the white frosting on the table, the cold footage of the camera, and his own cowardly silence. Tun collapsed into the nearest chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. He did not cry out loud, but his face was no longer the face of a successful man in a luxury mansion. It was the face of a son who had just realized he had lost the most precious thing in his life on the very day he should have cherished it most. Outside, Ibrahim's car was already waiting. The driver hurried forward and opened the rear door, then bowed deeply to Mama Ifunanya, a small gesture, but perhaps to her, it was also something rare to be treated with respect without having to beg for it. Ibrahim helped her into the car first. He bent down to adjust the edge of her clothing so it would not catch in the door, then gently closed it. Only after making sure she was seated comfortably did he walk around to the other side. In the final moment before getting into the car, he turned and looked back at the mansion. That look needed no further words. Everything that had to be said, he had already said. Every truth that had to be uncovered, he had already uncovered. What came next was no longer his anger. It was consequence. The car door closed. The vehicle pulled slowly away from the brightly lit courtyard. Inside the mansion, no one followed. No one called out. No one had the right. Behind them on the long table at the center of the room, the birthday cake still remained, completely destroyed. Frosting smeared over the edge of the table. Sugar flowers crushed out of shape. The birthday message blurred beyond recognition. The candles bent and broken to one side. Wax hardened into stiff streaks, as if the false joy of the evening had frozen to death before it ever finished burning. It lay there, like the family that had just collapsed, not because of one shove into a cake, but because that was only the final moment that revealed what had already been rotting for a long time. Ingratitude, cowardice, arrogance, and the habit of looking down on a mother who had sacrificed too much. That night, the mansion stayed lit until very late, but no one felt it was warm anymore, because the one person who deserved to be called the heart of that home had left. And there are houses that, from the moment they lose the person who quietly carried their soul for so many years, stop being homes at all. They become nothing more than beautiful walls, standing still in the dark. There are people you look at and think they are weak, just because they choose to stay silent. But what you don't know is that behind that silence is a lifetime of endurance, of sacrifice, of stepping back so others could move forward. And you also don't know that some of the people you look down on today were once someone else's entire world, a home, a meal, a reason to keep going. When the truth is revealed, don't blame the camera. The camera doesn't make you look bad. It only does one thing. It shows who you really are when no one is left to defend you. So, before you laugh at someone else's pain, before you think no one is watching, before you believe that silence means weakness, remember this. Karma doesn't rush, but when it arrives, it comes to the right person at the right time, and it never misses. If this story made you think, leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more stories ahead, where the truth will always be the most surprising part.